Hello class, my name is Matthew McGuire, and today I'm reviewing Everything in Its Path by Kai T. Erickson. He was a sociologist on the legal disposition team in the aftermath of the disaster. The book has a historical section, a social section that focuses on Buffalo Creek and the coal mining industry in general, and then his analysis in the aftermath of the disaster. It utilizes a lot of personal stories and quotes from victims as well. What's important here to note first is that there are 3 dams that burst, not just one, each pouring into the next, increasing the speed and size of the flood. Heavy rains were to contribute to this, atypical for the season, and then snowmelt, a larger than average snowmelt from the mountains, also contributed to the rise and the weakening of the dams. Now, the dams themselves were weak because they were made of the same material going into the water, just in a drier form. It was the runoff, sludge, residue, and debris left over from mining in the mines, packed down only by vehicles that were coming to deliver more sludge or material for the dams themselves. The other dams had been created because each dam in turn had reached near their limit, and they weren't able to do much with that, cleaning very little of that water. The mining company referred to this as an act of God, and were quoted in the book as saying from one official that the dams burst because they just couldn't hold the water that God had poured into them, relieving themselves of much responsibility. The approximation of death varies a little from source to source, but they generally say 4,000 to 5,000 homeless and 125 or just a few less dead. The average speed comes from the average as it fell down the hill. It did speed up at points where it was steeper or it got clogged and then just burst through. It went slower at points where it was starting to level off or was picking up a lot of debris. The damage costs come from the ad hoc governor's report that occurred in the aftermath as well. So the book focused on a historical, sociological bias. And this is important because he was a sociologist. So he talked about everything about how the individual's problems could affect the community, and the community could affect the individual. He painted the Appalachian people in a very romantic light from a historical sense, always talking about how they had this quaint sense of community that the rest of the nation perhaps had lost. The PTSD symptoms were the ones that he associated with individual trauma. This individual trauma could amplify the collective trauma, whereas you have individuals blaming each other, as one couple did in the book, or you have individuals feeling survivor's guilt after the fact, and he compared it to soldiers surviving where their teammates did not. And then collective trauma, where you have community shock as well. So these smaller problems affect the larger picture of individuals falling apart in the community, but they also lost their community from the destruction, which was only amplified by the relief efforts, where they were building houses and temporary homes wherever they could, and putting people into whatever groups were the most convenient and easy to slip them into. Unfortunately, this left these people without a community of their own, in an alien environment, and even more isolated because the people that they might have been able to connect with weren't there. They were in another community a few areas over. So the impacts of this. The Mine Safety Health Administration put up new regulations and created emergency action plans in case of another disaster. Unfortunately, they didn't want to take a more regulatory stance, so that means that there wasn't a lot of enforcement that they were willing to do or even implement, despite the fact that they had senatorial approval. These new regulations did cut down on some illegal dumping and did increase their inspection rate, but it didn't prevent future disasters, as there was no enforcement mechanisms put into play. Terminology that came out of this: NATEC, referring to natural and technological disasters that came together. A risk society thesis, referring to societies that are at risk by the very nature of the human progress or industries that they're in. Mining involves a lot of issues like black lung, bad backs, leg injuries, and possibly death from not just disaster, but the automated mining equipment and just cave-ins themselves. So those societies are at high risk, but they're necessary. So just removing people from that environment isn't always possible. Now, this book is actually highly cited. Almost every work I found had this referenced at some point, or pulled a quote from it, or even just a quote from one of the victims. And it was even used in FEMA training. On the FEMA training website that we went to, I was able to find that they had lifted the entire community impact section out of the book and had training guides on it, referring to what would you do in this scenario? How can you prevent this sort of social breakdown in the aftermath of a disaster? And this is what a bibliography looks like. Thank you for listening, and have a wonderful day.